Boston in 1852 was a city swollen with money and manners. Every brick on Beacon Hill seemed to hum with old wealth. By day the streets shined with respectability. Lace gloves, polished boots, servants hurrying behind iron gates. By night the gas lamps glowed through fog, throwing soft gold across the carriages, rolling past mansions older than the Republic itself. Between that March and the following October, 7 young men from Boston's richest families were found dead. Each death was ruled an accident, a fall, a fever, a carriage mishap. Tragic but ordinary. The papers gave them a few lines, then silence. The coroner's notes were brief and tidy. But no one asked why each of those men had signed a private contract with the same woman, Margaret Lawrence, the widow of Beacon Hill. Every one of them had signed exactly 9 months before he died. The newspapers ignored it. The city's upper class preferred quiet. Among them, scandal was worse than sin, and silence could hide almost anything. Dr. Samuel Hwitt was the first to sense the decay beneath the polished surface. He had come to Beacon Hill that winter, 27 years old, freshly graduated from Harvard Medical College. A serious young man, eager to prove himself among those twice his age. His father had been a schoolteacher in Salem, his mother a woman who lived by duty and restraint. Samuel came from decency, not wealth. No family crest, no inheritance, only his education and his stubborn conscience. He opened a small office on Charles Street, facing neat hedges and the steady rhythm of carriages. His first patients were merchants, housemaids, and workmen's wives. He mixed his own tonics and charged little for them. The wealthy had their own physicians, old men who served the same families for generations. But Samuel worked hard and stayed late. Slowly people began to speak his name. Servants talked to each other, and through their whispers he started to hear rumors about a house that no one respectable mentioned aloud. The Lawrence mansion stood on Mount Vernon Street. 4 stories of red brick and white trim, an iron fence, a garden trimmed like a soldier's coat. Its tall windows seemed to watch the street. The house had been built by Josiah Lawrence, a shipping magnate who made his fortune during the wars in Europe. His grandson Thomas had multiplied that fortune through textile mills. The Lawrences were more than rich. They were power itself. Then in February of 1851, Thomas Lawrence died suddenly. Whispers spread through every drawing room in the city. A fall down his own grand staircase, they said. The mayor, 2 judges, even a congressman had been there that night, dining and drinking. The coroner ruled it an accident before the body was cold. People who saw Margaret the next morning said she was calm, dressed in widow's black, her back straight, her eyes dry. Her grief looked rehearsed, almost deliberate. At 43, Margaret Lawrence was still striking. Tall, elegant, with silver-grey eyes that seemed to weigh everything they saw. She had been born Margaret von Haussmann, daughter of a Prussian scholar who had come to teach at Harvard in the 1820s. Her English was perfect. Her accent faint but persistent, like the echo of another life. In her youth she had been admired for her beauty and her intellect. She married Thomas Lawrence at 23. It was a perfect match. Intelligence joined with money, ambition tied to power. When Thomas died, she became one of the wealthiest women in Boston. She had 3 daughters, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Anne, aged 22, 20, and 18. After the funeral, they disappeared behind their iron gate. No church attendance, no social calls, no invitations accepted. Curtains closed. The city murmured sympathy, then moved on to fresh gossip. Samuel first heard the name Lawrence from a housemaid named Bridget O'Sullivan. She came to him one rainy evening with a fever. While sipping her medicine, she mentioned her employer, Mrs. Lawrence, was hiring new maids for a private part of the house. Young women only, girls who would work without questions. When Samuel asked how large the household was, Bridget laughed softly and said, "Larger than you'd think." though few ever see who lives in those rooms. The way she said it unsettled him. A few weeks later, Samuel passed the mansion after dark. A single light glowed behind an upper window. A woman's silhouette moved slowly behind the curtain. He thought of Bridget's words. The hidden rooms. The family that never stepped into daylight. Boston was obsessed with order in those days. Every life had its rules. How long a widow must mourn. Which church to attend. How many callers a young lady could receive. Women like the Lawrence daughters were expected to marry well and continue the family name. To see all three of them unmarried and unseen was not just strange, it was unnatural. But no one questioned Margaret Lawrence. Her fortune protected her. Her name opened doors that others only knocked upon. Behind those drawn curtains, the widow had turned her grief into something far darker. The mansion had become her private laboratory. She had convinced herself that her father's old studies on heredity were the key to improving mankind. In Europe, his colleagues had written about breeding strength into bloodlines, the way farmers bred stronger cattle or finer horses. Margaret had listened. She had believed. Her husband had called those ideas grotesque, but now he was gone, and she was free to prove them. She began collecting genealogies of Boston's oldest families, tracing their health, their intellect, and their children's fates. She wrote in secret to one of her father's associates in Prussia, a physician who encouraged her to continue the work. Together, they refined the plan. Margaret's vision was clear and horrifying. She would create superior children by arranging controlled unions between her daughters and carefully selected men. The men would be paid, then discarded. They were not lovers or husbands, only instruments. The first was Jonathan Leal, age 24, third son of a textile baron. He came to the mansion on a wet afternoon in March 1852, following a letter that promised great reward for a man of discretion. He left that night with a signed contract and a pocket full of promises worth $3,000. His fate was sealed before he stepped back into the rain. For months, he visited the house twice each week. He was taken to a locked room on the third floor, where Catherine Lawrence waited in silence. She was pale and obedient, her eyes hollow. Within months, she was pregnant. A shady doctor confirmed it. Jonathan received part of his payment and was dismissed. 6 months later, he was found dead beneath a freight wagon. The coroner called it an accident. Mrs. Lawrence sent flowers to the funeral and returned home to prepare for the next participant. 2 others followed. William Elbridge from a shipbuilding family and Henry Cunningham, son of a political dynasty. Both fathered children. Both died before seeing them born. By autumn of 1853, all 3 Lawrence daughters were expecting. All 3 men were gone, and no one in Boston spoke a word of it. Samuel would have remained unaware, if not for chance. In November, he was called to the mansion to treat a servant named Mary Finnegan, who had collapsed from exhaustion. The family's regular doctor was unavailable, so they summoned Samuel instead. The butler, a tall man with a hard expression, led him through the grand hall. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something sharper beneath it, like iron and decay. The silence felt thick, as though the house itself held its breath. As they passed the main staircase, Samuel noticed a locked door at the top landing. Behind it, he thought he heard movement, maybe even a soft cry. The butler's voice cut the air. That floor was private. In the servants' quarters, Mary lay pale and trembling. Samuel prescribed rest and proper food, but his advice earned only a cold glance. As he gathered his things, a young woman appeared in the hall, her body heavy with pregnancy, her face empty, her eyes wide and glassy like someone walking through a dream. She passed without a word, moving slowly up the stairs toward the locked floor. Samuel knew then who she was. One of the Lawrence daughters. The butler returned and ushered him to the door. The young ladies, he said, were not receiving visitors. That night Samuel couldn't sleep. He saw that blank stare every time he closed his eyes. Whatever was happening inside that house wasn't illness. It was control. Over the next weeks he began asking quiet questions. Servants trusted doctors more than masters. Bit by bit the truth emerged. The daughters never left the house. They weren't allowed to write letters or even open their own windows. They ate only what their mother approved. At night, servants heard the sound of babies crying, then sudden silence. There were rumors of books filled with strange measurements, notes written in a hand too steady to belong to grief. Samuel started digging through Harvard's archives, searching old letters from Margaret's father. He found papers discussing heredity, human selection, and the breeding of virtue and vigor. There were hints of experiments done in Europe and cover-ups that kept them hidden. The widow's madness was not born from loneliness. It was learned. She had turned her father's theories into practice, and Boston's polite society had given her the perfect hiding place. By the first frost of winter, Samuel Hwitt understood the truth. What went on behind those shuttered windows wasn't mourning. It was murder disguised as science, and the most powerful people in the city wanted it kept that way. Winter crept into Boston like a sickness that year, freezing the Charles and glazing the cobblestones with sheets of ice. The wind carried the smoke of 100 chimneys through the narrow streets, but the glow behind Beacon Hill's windows seemed colder than the frost outside. Dr. Samuel Hwitt walked those streets with the caution of a man who sensed that knowledge itself could be dangerous. He had been trained to observe patterns, the small signs that turned chaos into understanding. But what he was seeing now felt like a pattern, designed to consume anyone who looked too closely. The deaths of the 3 young men troubled him most. Their names kept appearing in casual conversation, in whispers at coffee houses or muttered condolences during Sunday services. Jonathan Leal crushed under a wagon, William Elbridge falling from a roof, Henry Cunningham struck down by sudden heart failure. Each from a different family, each wealthy, educated, promising. Each connected in some way to the Lawrence mansion. When Samuel examined their death records through a friend at the registrar's office, his unease turned to dread. The official reports were tidy, but the medical notes buried within them spoke of details that didn't fit. Jonathan Leal's arms had shown deep bruises, the kind that came from restraint. Elbridge's neck had been broken from a fall, but witnesses claimed he'd been seen arguing with 2 unidentified men before his death. Cunningham's report mentioned faint puncture marks on his arms, dismissed as irrelevant. 3 accidents that looked increasingly deliberate. Samuel knew what that meant. Someone powerful was manipulating the system, turning murder into misfortune with the stroke of a pen. Around him, Boston's elite continued to toast their prosperity. Gas lamps flickered along Beacon Street, casting halos around carriages that carried families to dinner parties where nothing mattered more than appearance. But Samuel began to see those streets differently now. The cobblestones like a chessboard, every move decided long before the players understood the game. He couldn't confront Margaret Lawrence openly. Not yet. The widow held influence that reached beyond her iron gates. Judges dined at her table. The mayor's advisor had once invested in her husband's mills. To accuse her without undeniable proof would ruin him long before it touched her. The chance to gather that proof came unexpectedly. In December of 1853, Samuel was summoned to the Lawrence mansion again. One of the servants was ill, the message said. But when he arrived, he learned the truth. One of the daughters had given birth, and complications had followed. The butler unlocked the 3rd-floor door, with a brass key that seemed older than the house itself. The air changed instantly, heavy, perfumed wrong. The walls were lined with pale wallpaper and portraits of ancestors staring down with lifeless pride. He could smell laudanum, milk, and something faintly metallic beneath both. Anne Lawrence lay on a bed drenched in sweat, her body burning with fever. Puerperal infection. A common killer, but one that no amount of wealth could always fend off. Samuel worked quickly, applying cold compresses, dosing quinine, washing his hands in carbolic water, methods new enough to make other doctors call him reckless. Margaret stood in the corner throughout, silent and still, watching her daughter with eyes that held no warmth. She asked about symptoms, prognosis, expected time to death, all in the measured tone of a scientist collecting data. Never once did she touch her child. When Samuel told her the infection was severe, she merely noted the information as if filing it away for later. If Anne died, she said evenly, the child would require a wet nurse. That single sentence hollowed Samuel's stomach. There was no grief, no panic, only calculation. While Margaret stepped out to instruct a servant, Samuel's eyes fell on the desk near the window. Books and ledgers lay open, dozens of them filled with dense handwriting. He flipped one open and froze. Names, dates, genealogies. Each page meticulously organized. Columns labeled subject, parentage, observation, disposition. There were entries for Leal, Elbridge, Cunningham, and beside each name, a chilling note. Disposition completed. The dates matched their deaths. Methods noted with clinical precision: wagon, fall, injection. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. Murder recorded like lab results. Farther down the pages were details about infants, each labeled by letter and number: A1, B1, C1. Weights, head circumference, muscle tone, reflexes. Notes on appearance: promising skull shape, strong grip. Subject A1 demonstrates superior lung capacity. And then another name, D1, persistent respiratory weakness. Unsuitable for study. Removed April 3, 1854. He understood now what removed meant. The unwanted had been erased, quietly, efficiently. Margaret's footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Samuel slammed the ledger shut, pretending to check Anne's pulse. When she re-entered the room, her expression hadn't changed. She spoke briefly to the butler, gave a curt nod, and left. 3 days later, Anne Lawrence was dead. Her body was interred in the family plot, her mother dry-eyed as ever. Samuel attended the burial only to confirm his growing suspicion. No one but servants wept. After that day, Samuel's resolve hardened. He could no longer pretend ignorance. Margaret Lawrence was breeding human beings like livestock and discarding the ones that failed her expectations. But he had to proceed carefully. Her power made her untouchable through ordinary channels. If he exposed her without proof, she'd ruin him, or worse. The men who had helped her silence those earlier deaths would make sure his own looked just as accidental. Then, in April of the following year, fate sent him the witness he needed. A young woman appeared at his office one evening, trembling and pale, clutching an infant's bonnet. Her name was Sophia Prescott, a former maid from the Lawrence mansion. She had worked in the third-floor nursery and told him, through tears, that her baby had vanished. The child had been born healthy but had developed a cough. When she awoke one morning, the cradle was empty. Mrs. Lawrence had told her the child was defective, that it had been removed. She had been paid $50 and dismissed under threat of being institutionalized if she spoke of it. Sophia's story confirmed what Samuel had read in the ledger. The letter D had belonged to her child. He told her to hide, to stay with someone she trusted, and promised to investigate. That night, he paced his small office for hours, torn between duty and fear. He knew what Margaret was capable of. She had killed 3 men, perhaps more. She could have him eliminated just as easily. Still, he couldn't stop. His opportunity came sooner than expected. In late April, another urgent note arrived. One of the daughters, Elizabeth, was suffering severe complications after childbirth. Margaret requested him specifically. Samuel knew it was dangerous, but he went. He couldn't ignore the chance to see the 3rd floor again. Elizabeth's condition was serious, but not immediately fatal. He treated her with care, insisting he would need to return daily to monitor her recovery. Margaret agreed. That access became his window into the house. On his 3rd visit, while the servants fetched clean linens, Samuel moved quickly. He slipped past the nursery and found a locked door at the far end of the corridor. The keyhole smelled faintly of oil, as though often used. He used a thin surgical probe to turn the latch, a trick learned from a locksmith he once treated for gout. The lock gave way with a soft click. The room beyond was colder than the hallway. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars that glimmered under the low gaslight. Inside them, shapes floated, organs, small bodies, pale tissue. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. These weren't medical specimens from animals or adults. They were infants, preserved, dissected, numbered. Margaret had been cataloguing her victims. Each jar bore a label matching the designations from her ledgers: E1, F1, G1, notes written in the same elegant, precise hand described causes of rejection: poor cranial symmetry, susceptibility to disease, constitutional frailty. On the central table lay another ledger, open to a fresh page. The ink was still drying. The entry read, Subject H1, birth pending. Potential paternal line, Prescott. Sophia's name. Samuel photographed the page with the small camera he'd borrowed from a colleague. One of the new wet plate models. Slow and clumsy, but enough to capture evidence. He was slipping the glass plate into his bag when the door opened. Margaret stood there. Her grey eyes glimmered in the dim light like steel catching flame. She didn't look surprised. She spoke quietly, her voice smooth as polished marble, asking why he had gone where he wasn't invited. Samuel's mind screamed for him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She moved like someone in perfect control of her own madness. Every word she spoke was calm, every expression measured. She told him that what he had seen was not horror, but progress. That nature itself was cruel, that she was merely obeying its laws with purpose and precision. Every farmer culls the weak, she said, though her tone made it sound like scripture. Every gardener prunes the diseased branch to let the healthy bloom. What she was doing was no different, refining humanity, one generation at a time. Samuel could barely hear his own heartbeat through the roaring in his ears. She wasn't insane in the ordinary sense. Her logic was flawless within its own monstrous boundaries. She truly believed herself a visionary. By the time Samuel reached Court Street, his arm was bleeding, his breath torn to shreds by the cold night air. He had escaped the mansion, but he could feel the weight of pursuit in every echo behind him. The streets were nearly empty, lit only by the hiss of gas lamps flickering through mist. Boston slept under its quilt of respectability, unaware that something monstrous had been living among its finest families. He burst into Josiah Fletcher's law office, half delirious from pain and exhaustion. Fletcher, still awake under the lamplight, rose at once. The older man listened as Samuel poured out the story, the laboratory, the ledgers, the preserved bodies, the confrontation. By the end, the lawyer's face had hardened into grim resolve. They both understood the danger. Margaret Lawrence wasn't just a wealthy widow. She was a woman protected by the city's most powerful men. Fletcher bound Samuel's wounded arm, then locked the office door. He explained that he had been waiting for something like this, though not nearly as terrible. Months earlier, he'd been approached by the father of Jonathan Leal, one of the supposed accident victims. The man had discovered a strange document among his son's effects, a contract between Jonathan and Margaret Lawrence, written in careful legal language that disguised something sordid. $3,000 in exchange for services unnamed. Fletcher had suspected blackmail, but the old man's sudden death had ended the inquiry before it began. Until now, the document had gathered dust in his drawer. Samuel unrolled it and saw what he already knew, the proof that every death was bound to Margaret's design. The two men sat in silence as the city outside shifted toward dawn. Fletcher was a lawyer of reputation and caution, but beneath that veneer lived a moral core as unbending as Samuel's. He promised to help expose her, though they would need allies who could not be bought or silenced. One name came to him immediately: Captain Reginald Barnes of the Massachusetts State Police, a man known for integrity in a city that had forgotten what that meant. They left before sunrise in a hired coach, taking back streets through Roxbury's industrial quarter. Samuel watched the city slide past, the mills along the Charles trailing smoke like the exhalations of restless ghosts. He realized how easily wealth could hide wickedness here, how science could wear a gentleman's coat while feeding on the helpless. At the state police barracks, Captain Barnes listened without interruption. His jaw tightened as Samuel described the preserved infants, the ledgers of murder, the contracts. When the physician produced the photographic plates, the captain leaned forward and stared at them for a long time. He warned them that these were serious accusations against untouchable people. Judges, businessmen, men who defined Boston's image of itself. But once he looked at the images again, his hesitation vanished. He would move that night. Barnes was not the kind of man who waited for permission to do what was right. He said the governor himself would need to see the evidence if they wanted the raid to survive the political storm that would follow. Until then, Samuel would remain in protective custody. But power moves faster than justice. Before their plan could take shape, a messenger arrived with grim news. The Lawrence mansion had burned in the night. The fire began just after midnight, roaring through the upper floors with unnatural speed. By the time the volunteer brigade arrived, the house was an inferno, the flames visible all the way to the common. Neighbors said they'd heard no screams, only the crack of timbers and the collapse of the great roof. The blaze devoured everything: the ledgers, the jars, the nursery, the lives of everyone inside. Samuel listened in stunned silence. All the proof he had risked his life to obtain was gone. The fire was too perfect, too sudden. Margaret had known. She had destroyed her laboratory and every witness to her crimes. But the messenger's voice faltered as he added something else. Not all the bodies were accounted for. The ashes held fewer remains than the household required, and a carriage had been seen leaving Mount Vernon Street shortly before the fire began, heading toward the harbor. Fletcher's mind moved as fast as the truth itself. Margaret would not hide in Boston. She would flee. Her accent, her letters to Prussia, all pointed to one destination: the docks. Barnes sent riders ahead to the waterfront, while he, Samuel, and Fletcher went before the governor with what evidence remained. Governor Clifford, a cautious man who measured morality by its effect on politics, studied the photographs and documents in silence. His face darkened as he realized what they implied: a conspiracy among his own class. He agreed to authorize the arrests, but insisted the process be contained. The city, he said, must not descend into scandal. Before they could leave, word came back from the harbor. A ship called the Bremen Star had departed at dawn for Hamburg. On the manifest was a widow traveling under the name Margaret von Haussmann, with 2 adult daughters and 3 young children. Margaret had escaped. The revelation struck Samuel like a blow. She had fled back to the land that birthed her obsession, carrying her surviving experiments, the 3 children, with her. All the law, all the evidence, all his desperate courage had amounted to nothing. The true architect of the horror would vanish across the Atlantic, free to begin again. But Fletcher refused to let despair close the case. Even if the widow had fled, her allies remained. The rot beneath Beacon Hill had many roots, and cutting them could still bring justice of a kind. The governor authorized a special tribunal. Within days, Captain Barnes led raids on the homes of those tied to the Society for Human Advancement, a secret circle of academics, judges, and politicians who met in fine parlors to discuss improving mankind through selective breeding. They had believed Margaret's project to be their proof of concept, a living experiment validating their ideas. Records seized from the Society's meeting house on Louisburg Square revealed names that shook Boston's foundation. Judge Harrison Apprentice, the same man who had presided over Thomas Lawrence's suspicious death. Coroner Virgil Danforth, who had ruled every convenient accident that followed. Several legislators, a publisher, even the mayor's advisor, all men of learning, all believers in a grotesque vision wrapped in the language of progress. For years they had met under the pretense of philanthropy, exchanging papers on human heredity and civilization. But behind those discussions lay something darker, an agreement to protect one another's interests while the widow did their work. Her mansion had been their hidden laboratory, and her fortune, their funding. As Barnes's officers arrested Danforth, they found sealed envelopes containing large payments traced back to Lawrence family accounts. The coroner confessed first. His trembling hands signed the statement that would unravel the entire circle. He admitted to altering reports, falsifying causes of death, and disposing of evidence. Judge Apprentice tried to fight back. He used his position to delay hearings, filed injunctions, and called in favors from every corner of government. But the testimony piled too high to bury. Servants spoke of his visits to the mansion at night, of meetings behind locked doors. Bank ledgers revealed quiet transfers from Lawrence accounts to his own. The facade of moral authority cracked wide open. By midsummer, Boston's newspapers could no longer stay silent. The Beacon Hill conspiracy became the scandal of the decade. Editors printed cautious versions of the truth, omitting the worst details, but hinting at horrors beyond imagination. The city's genteel world, built on church pews and pedigree, found itself staring into a mirror that reflected rot instead of virtue. Samuel watched from the margins as the trials began. He gave his testimony behind closed doors, recounting the nightmarish things he had seen, the laboratory, the ledgers, the infants preserved in jars. His words were recorded in careful script, but even in those cold transcripts, the revulsion could be felt. The court condemned Coroner Danforth to 10 years of hard labor. Judge Apprentice received 20. Others resigned quietly, their reputations erased. A handful fled north to Canada. The Society for Human Advancement dissolved, its members scattering like roaches when the light touched them. But none of it satisfied Samuel. Margaret had built this monstrosity, and she was still out there. Somewhere across the sea she breathed the same air, wrote her cold notes in the same steady hand, and perhaps looked into the faces of her grandchildren with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. He began to dream of her, sometimes in her laboratory, sometimes on a ship surrounded by fog, her grey eyes reflecting lantern light as she whispered to the sleeping children beside her. The governor declared the matter closed by autumn. The trials had cleansed the city, he said. The guilty had been punished. Boston could return to its rightful dignity. But Samuel knew that wasn't true. Evil didn't vanish because men signed verdicts. It changed shape, hid under new names, waited for another chance. Fletcher continued to fight. He drafted laws requiring multiple physicians to confirm suspicious deaths, a reform that would later be praised as the first of its kind. But privately, he confessed to Samuel that he doubted the system could ever protect against people like Margaret Lawrence. Power had a way of bending. Years passed, but the story of the Lawrence mansion refused to die. Boston rebuilt its pride, but the name still lingered like smoke that never quite cleared. People called it the Beacon Hill affair in whispers. To some it was a scandal, to others a ghost story. But for Dr. Samuel Hwitt, it became the thing that lived behind every heartbeat. He carried the memory of that night like a fever. The smell of burning wood, the image of Margaret's eyes in the dark, the sound of the city pretending nothing had happened. The fire had destroyed the mansion, but not the truth. Too many questions remained, too many gaps. And Samuel knew that silence was the weapon Boston used best. The trials of her accomplices had ended. The city moved on. But somewhere across the ocean, Margaret Lawrence was alive. He could feel it. In the spring of 1857, 4 years after the fire, Samuel received a letter sealed in wax. It had no return address. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, like a scientist labeling a specimen. Inside were only a few lines, written in German. He translated them slowly. The work continues. Boston was only the beginning, no signature. But he knew who had sent it. He tried to let it go. He told himself the past was a nightmare, that the world had already punished her in its own way. But, at night, he would wake to the memory of those preserved infants, those blank-eyed daughters, those ledgers filled with numbers where names should have been. And now, the thought of her continuing her work somewhere else filled him with dread. He began searching for any trace of her overseas. He wrote to colleagues in Europe, to doctors, to universities. Months passed before he received a reply from a professor in Berlin who remembered a foreign widow renting a laboratory on the outskirts of the city. She had spoken little, paid in gold, and worked with unnatural focus. The name she gave was Madame von Haussmann. The professor said she was studying heredity and child development. Her subjects were orphans. No one questioned her methods because she provided funding the city needed. Samuel knew then that she had built another mansion, only colder, and this time there were no neighbors to watch the windows. He wanted to travel to Germany, but his health was already failing. The years of stress and sleeplessness had left him hollow. Still, he gathered his notes and sent them to an American journalist stationed in London, a man named Henry Wallace, who had once reported on the Beacon Hill case. He asked Wallace to investigate, to follow any lead that carried her name. Months passed before another letter came. Wallace had gone to Berlin. He had found her. She was living outside the city, in a small estate by the river. She called it House Eden. 3 daughters lived with her, all grown now, all carrying the same grey eyes. The locals avoided the house. They said strange music played at night and lights glowed in the windows long after midnight. The journalist had managed to see her once, leaving the university's medical building. She wore black gloves and carried a book bound in red leather. Her hair was streaked with silver, but her posture was unbroken. To everyone who saw her, she was simply a wealthy patron of science, a widow funding research in human perfection. Wallace's final note chilled Samuel to the core. He wrote that children from nearby orphanages had begun to vanish. No one dared accuse her. Her influence reached high places, just as it had in Boston. After that letter, Wallace disappeared. His editor said he had gone traveling. But Samuel knew better. He tried to warn others, but the world was not ready to listen. People believed in progress, in reason, in the promise of science. They did not want to hear that progress could wear the face of evil. So he locked his records away, buried them beneath his floorboards, and waited for the day when truth might be worth more than silence. As years turned to decades, Samuel faded into obscurity. He lived alone in a narrow house by the harbor, surrounded by books and ghosts. Sometimes he would walk past the new mansions on Beacon Hill, where laughter and piano music spilled from windows, and think of the house that once stood there. People said it was cursed, but time had polished even that story into myth. He aged quietly, his hair white, his hands unsteady. But his mind never let go. He could not stop imagining those children Margaret had taken. He wondered what became of them, the ones she had called her successes. Were they still alive? Were they walking through European cities brilliant and beautiful, unaware of the horror that had created them? He died in 1891, sitting at his desk, with a half-finished letter before him. The note was addressed to the Massachusetts Historical Society. It warned that the ideas behind the Beacon Hill affair were not gone, that they were spreading under new names, dressed in respectability. His handwriting trembled toward the end. The letter was never sent. It was found years later by a young archivist who didn't know what to make of it. She filed it under Miscellaneous Correspondence, 19th century. It stayed there, forgotten. But the story did not end there. Half a century later, in 1938, an American researcher visiting Berlin uncovered an old property deed. It belonged to a long-abandoned estate called House Eden. Among the papers were medical records written in English, signed by Monsieur von Haussmann. The notes spoke of controlled pairings, selection by intellect, and cross-generational study results. The signature was unmistakable. Margaret Lawrence, the widow of Beacon Hill, had continued her work until her death in 1878. But what she left behind was more than paper. The researcher found references to children placed into private schools across Europe under false names. No records of their origins, no record of what became of them. The estate was destroyed during the war that followed, and most of the evidence vanished again, swallowed by fire just as before. And yet, every few decades her name reappeared. Not in gossip, not in crime, but in science. Theories about improving humanity, papers about selective heredity. Always the same language, always the same idea wearing a new face. Maybe her bloodline survived. Maybe her teachings were simply passed from one believer to another. But the pattern never stopped. Every generation found someone willing to repeat her mistake, to dress cruelty as progress, to call control a form of mercy. Even now, Beacon Hill stands polished and proud, its gas lamps replaced by electric light. Tourists walk past Mount Vernon Street without knowing what once stood there. The air is quiet, the gardens perfect, the windows bright. But sometimes when the fog rolls in from the harbor and the wind touches the old bricks just right, locals say they hear something faint, like a woman's voice counting, measuring, whispering to unseen children. The house is gone, the woman is dust, but her idea never died, and perhaps that is the true horror of the widow of Beacon Hill, that her ghost does not haunt a mansion, but the minds of those who still believe perfection can be built from blood.